Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4. We are just moving right along this semester. This is the week that we're actually going to do what it is we've been talking about for the last several, which is to begin testing our students, finally. Before we get into that though, I do want to mention that you're going to start to see your graded assignments in Grade Center on Blackboard. And I want to let you know that for any paper that you've turned in, when you go into the grade and look at the specific feedback, you're going to see not only your score there, but you'll also see that I've uploaded a document that is your document with your title with the text graded at the end. When you open that document, you're going to see that I've provided specific feedback to you, and at the very end, you'll see a scored copy of the rubric. When you go into week 4 this week, you're going to see that a large portion of the resources are geared towards formal assessments, and specifically that Woodcock-Johnson assessment. Even if you're using a different formal assessment though to test your student because your district uses something different, there are still plenty of resources there for you. So please make sure that as you go through, you read carefully to make sure that you have all of the information that you need before you get started. No matter which assessment you plan to utilize, you've most likely come across the terms cognitive and achievement. Based on what I've seen in your papers and also on the discussion board, I wanted to provide some clarification regarding those two terms to make sure that you're able to distinguish between them. A cognitive test, frequently referred to as an IQ test, measures a person's ability to reason and to learn. An achievement test measures how much a person has learned or retained, how much information they've retained. You can think of a cognitive test as your potential to learn, and the achievement test as the degree to which you've met or reached your potential. I had a great professor named Norm who used a cup analogy to explain these two terms, and I really like it, so I'm going to share it with you. The cognitive test, when you participate in that, will sort of determine the size of your mental cup or the capacity that you have for learning. You could test and be determined to be a person with a 24-ounce mental cup or potential to learn, or you could take that cognitive IQ test and be found to be a person who has the 16-ounce mental capacity to learn. Okay, if you take your achievement test and your achievement test suggests that you have learned or retained 24 ounces of knowledge or water or whatever it is you put in cups like this, then you have learned and retained information to your capacity. If you're a 24-ounce cup though, and your achievement test suggests that you have learned or retained 12 ounces of your capacity, then somewhere in the process of learning, there is something that's keeping you from reaching your full potential. You may have heard this described as the discrepancy theory for determining eligibility for special education. That basically suggests that there's a difference between your potential to learn and the amount that you are learning. As you prepare to measure your students' learning this week, it's important that you establish an appropriate testing environment. There are some specific tips and information regarding this in the week 4 folder, so make sure you look out for those. Please remember that testing must happen outside of instructional time. Next week, I'm going to give you some specific information and some practice on scoring your Woodcock-Johnson assessment. So for this week, focus on collecting those raw score, getting the score number, and then next week we'll dive further into actually establishing a standard score. For most tests, you will be given a starting point based on the student's age or grade. Something that students find tricky often is the idea of basal and ceiling. So I want to go into that just for a quick moment before we wrap up and move on to the week. Some assessments utilize this concept of basal and ceiling. Think about it as floor and ceiling. The reason why we do that is that we want to sort of limit the number of test items that we present to an examinee. And we do that to reduce testing fatigue. We know that if someone is getting tired or is sort of feeling over the test, they may not perform to their best ability. Therefore, the test scores may not be as reliable as they could be, okay? A ceiling is established once a certain number of test questions are answered incorrectly. So once the ceiling is established, for example, 5 consecutive incorrect responses, you can assume that any further questions after that would also be incorrect. And therefore, you can stop testing on that subtest once the ceiling is met. The basal is the opposite. The basal is the starting point where we want to get a certain number of correct responses in a row. Let's say that the basal is 6 correct responses. If we establish 6 correct responses in a row, we can assume that any previous test questions or test items would have also been answered correctly. So that helps us determine if we're starting in the correct place. If the previous test questions were assumed to be answered correctly, meaning you've established your basal, you can count the previous test questions in the Woodcock-Johnson test as scored correctly. Okay, there's more information about this in the actual test manual, but sometimes it's a good idea to read it and also hear it. I know for me, it took some practice with that. So as you're going through and familiarizing yourself with the subtest, make sure, of course, you understand the directions and if there's any materials you need, but also review that starting point. Usually it's based on grade or age, and then review if there are any rules for basal and ceiling so you know where to start and where to stop. As always, please keep using that Ask Your Instructor tab. I think it's been a great resource for us this semester. And please ask me for help if you need it. I'm here for you. Have a great week.